probably attended at least a couple of weddings in your life. For my part, I've been part of many weddings here in the United States, enjoying different roles, everywhere from being a bridesmaid to actually officiating the weddings. I've also attended as guest member and family member. And I think that there's something cultural of having been part of weddings. Also, I was married in Argentina and in the United States. And so there's this cultural aspect to weddings here that ties into our need for everything to be scheduled. And maybe some of you resonate with that. Our schedules for the schedules to make sure that everything lines up perfectly. We wish that it was all neat. We see these reality TV shows like Bridezilla's where, the worst thing happens and then there's a brawl and, it's all built upon the drama of unexpected things happening. So through the years, what I've realized is that despite our very best efforts with weddings, we want everything to be perfect, we want it to be magical, and yet something inevitably goes not as expected, something that was not built into our preconceived notion or what the schedule was to be. So years back, my mother decided to get remarried, and so my family here in New Jersey planned to travel down. I was scheduled to be the bridesmaid or one of the maids of honor for my mother, and my husband was to be the pastor who was going to marry my mother and her husband. And so we were really excited about making this travel, and then all of a sudden, as maybe you won't be that surprised about, but all of a sudden we get this notification from the airlines that, there's a snowstorm coming on Sunday. And some of you might remember this years back. It was 26 inches that accumulated. And so on Thursday, we think, they're kind of, they're overreacting. They canceled 5,000 flights. There were no flights going out. And so all of a sudden, this image that we had of my mother's perfect wedding, this wonderful new husband of hers, was kind of in chaos. It went into limbo. And so we pivoted quickly, we adjusted, and I caught the train very pregnant with a toddling 1.5-year-old daughter. And it took 16 hours to arrive to Atlanta, where they accumulated half an inch. And that shut down the entire city. My husband's flight, which oddly enough, it was one of the few flights that had not been canceled, was scheduled after his Sunday services, and he was on the last flight out that left Newark. Now, there was a lot of anxiety on all sides of the family. Suddenly, there was this very significant change in circumstances, and we did not know if the ceremony would even go ahead as planned because we didn't have anyone to officiate if my husband didn't come. At the end, we made it, but I realized that receiving these alerts from the airports and on the television about the weather and reading the news, how important it was to pay attention. We had to stay alert. Today's text clearly underlines this important principle that Jesus teaches his disciples. Keep alert. And he goes on to exhort his disciples with the somewhat cruel imperative to say during a sermon, which is keep awake. And especially on a daylight savings Sunday, right? We're operating with one less hour of sleep. Reading this text may even jolt us in our pews as we settle in and we start to get comfortable. In fact, the texts that we have been studying during Lent leave room for a lot of discomfort. We've been following Jesus as he travels towards Jerusalem and teaches in synagogues, and have heard the mantra of this Lenten season over and over again. The last will be first, and the first will be last. Today we find Jesus and the disciples in the Temple of Jerusalem. This is after a long journey. They finally made it to Jerusalem, and they're in the temple that was at the center of Jewish life. The temple that had already been built by Solomon, had been destroyed and rebuilt once before. And as Jesus is leaving the temple with the disciples, after having debated with these religious leaders and engaged in all of their questions and warned about their hypocrisy, the disciples are leaving with Jesus, and they look around and they just make this comment about the sheer scale of the edifice. And this is an occasion for Jesus to look at the huge edifice, the huge building, and to predict the temple's destruction. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. Now, a statement like that could perk any of our interests, right? We're looking at in terms of looking and doing a tour of the city, looking at the grand structures, and then all of a sudden having this grand prediction. How could you not be interested in what he means? And so, of course, the disciples did follow up with Jesus later on to get some clarification. What does he mean by these buildings will be toppled? Isn't the temple the very locus of hope for the Jewish people? How can they prepare for such an event? How will they know what's going to happen? What will be the signs? And it is here that Jesus provides some apocalyptic predictions rooted in the apocalyptic literature of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that might make us squirm in our seats a little bit. At least I squirm a little. Wars, discord, earthquakes, false prophets. And then there's more. It doesn't stop there. There's darkness, there's suffering, there's falling stars, there's shaking heavens. Jesus is coming in clouds with power and glory after all of that. Keep alert. Keep awake. Now, the first century Christian community did not take this prediction lightly. In fact, they lived through the destruction of the temple, the pillage of their very hopes by the hands of the Roman soldiers. They were awaiting the return of Jesus in their own century. They were awaiting so anxiously and so much with preparation before that very generation passed that there were problems with folks leaving their work and not wanting to work anymore because they thought that the end was so imminent. They indeed embodied that hope and that expectancy. Keep alert. Keep awake. And certainly now, 2,000 years later, in our day and time, we know there is much interest in when and how and where the return of Jesus will happen. Any of you who have heard of the Left Behind series or the movies, you know that people are making predictions about the date of the end of the world and are very invested in it. And while I don't engage in such predictions about the end of the world and imagine the precise date, I do find myself wondering, how long, O Lord? Our world today is plagued by tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes and many more forms of natural disasters. When you prepared for Hurricane Sandy just a few years ago, we were all told to keep alert. Our world is plagued by evil and violence too. You'd have to be blind not to see it, right? And after the Twin Towers fell and thousands of people in this area were murdered, there was a terror alert that was on for months. Keep alert. And then, of course, there are innumerable threats that we face today, and those brothers and sisters around the world face as well. Threats of disease and war and terrorism, violence and destruction, hunger and poverty. Sadly, too many challenges to name. When we wonder, how long, O Lord, we are reminded by Jesus, don't give up. Don't give in to fear. Keep alert. Keep awake. The real question is, how do we stay alert? How do we stay awake? What is Jesus talking about here? With all that's happening around us, with the storms in the world, the storms in our own lives, our own relationships, how do we not succumb to that fear? What is Jesus telling us when he tells us to be on watch? It seems like keeping alert has more to do than just keeping our eyes open. It has to do with keeping our eyes open to what's going on around in the world and keeping our eyes open to the reverence that we need to have for God and for God's creation. It has to do with becoming aware, being tuned into how God is moving in the world, and being aware of God's calling to us, even as we wait for Jesus to return. One of my favorite writers, pastor and theologian Barbara Brown Taylor, writes about this art, this spiritual practice of paying attention in her Altar to the World. And specifically, she talks about the practice of paying attention. And she says this, that paying attention is about reverence. And reverence takes time. Reverence means you have to slow down. Someone suggested to her, so she tells this story about a woman that she knew who was losing her desire to live. And at the same time, she was overcome and wrought by this fear. She was older and lonely, and she was afraid if she fell asleep at night that she might not wake up in the morning. Each night she would lay awake terrified, and it wasn't until the sun rose each morning that she would finally get some rest. Now, someone close to her suggested that if she was awake, why didn't she do something with her time? Why didn't she listen maybe for the first bird chirping in the morning? So she took up the challenge, this woman, and soon she started noticing the birds that were chirping in the morning, and then she decided that she would name one of those birds, and then she started feeding the bird, and then it grew from there. She bought a bird house to feed the bird, and then several bird houses that she acquired, and she started to attract more and more birds. She went from staying awake to pass the night to staying awake and becoming in tune with herself and with God's creation. Over the course of those nights, something in her awakened. Something that was at last meaningful, at last joyful. She learned that though she had been staying awake before, she had truly awakened. Stay awake. Stay alert. And this is both the challenge and the promise that we receive today. Stay awake. Stay alert. There are reasons to lose sleep at night. Yes, there are. They are real. They ignite deep anxiety. But what Jesus tells us today is that the pain and the destruction is not the end of the story. Stay awake, stay alert. Move towards the fear of the Lord, the reverence for God that will not disappoint. Be aware of what's going on around you to those who are around you. The practice of awakening to our own purpose and our own vocation and our own role in the world as we await the promises that are to come. Though evil is real and the promises and the joy and power of Jesus are what call out to us. Slow down and waken today to God's calling. Pay attention, keep alert, stay awake. Amen.